Welcome back, everybody, to me talking about book adjacent things. And yes, this is going to be my first attempt, first take, of the video that I wanted to make on Orientalism and fantasy and problems with it and all of that. So let's see how all of that goes. And first of all, I want to thank my newest Patreon backer, Ariadne. This one's for you. Cheers. Yeah, if you want to get like a personal cheer or anything, there is a Patreon down there. I appreciate your support very much. But don't worry, there's no pressure or anything, and you're not missing out on special content. I'm not doing that because I feel awkward about that, I guess. Anyway, this is not what this is about. This is about Orientalism. So let me explain what I want to do, and then let me try to actually do that. All right? Okay. So I've spoken about that before, and that is that Orientalism is something that I think is a concern in fantasy literature and fantasy world building. And my plan to do this here is to first talk about what is Orientalism, by which I will give a short summary of the book that sort of starts the whole thing here, and that is Orientalism by Edward Said from 1978. And I'll give a short summary of what I think are the important points of the book for our discussion here. Then I'll thus, take out the terms of Orientalism, how I think they are applicable to fantasy. I'll give a few examples, and at the end of it, I'll once again make a statement on why I think this is a problem. So this looks sort of like part 1, 2, and 3. We will see if I can hold on to that 3-arc structure. I don't think I will. 3-act structure and videos from me are probably not going to go together too well. But nevertheless, let's start with Orientalism by Said and then move on from there. Alright, Orientalism by Edward Said from 1978 is a non-fiction book, one I recommend you go and read. There's a political dimension to it that I will not comment on here. That is specifically the Israel-Palestinian conflict that Said, as a Palestinian, is heavily involved with. And I don't think I have the right to make any comments on that specific situation. I have some personal connections to that place, and I have very much not the experience to make any statements on that. So I'll leave that part out, and ideally you'll refrain from arguing those kind of aspects down in the comments as well, because this is not about it. This is about what we can take away from the book for our purposes here, because those points are still valid. All right, that being said, let's start. In Orientalism, Said reconstructs what he calls Orientalism as an academic field, shows how that academic field connects to imperialism and colonialism, and has, impacts, political, historical, and so forth, impacts on the world as he sees it in 1978. It is thus part of the larger post-colonial movement around that time, and a move away from Eurocentrism in a lot of ways, and, just a really good book to read because it will make you think about a lot of things. And, yeah, so let's have a bit of a closer look there, right? Orientalism as an academic study, as an academic discipline, as Said sees it, starts around the beginning of the 19th century. He puts the conquest of Egypt by Napoleon as a starting point. You can probably argue about bits and pieces about that before, but the point is that around that time, the discipline of Orientalism sort of becomes more popular. There's almost an enthusiasm in France, later in England, also in Europe, in Germany, and other parts of the world, about the so-called Orient, that being, first, exploration of ancient cultures, and it starts out as ancient, ancient philology, people discovering the Rosetta Stone, starting to actually discover, unlock the secret, so to speak, of hieroglyphs, and deciphering hieroglyphs, people going to all these places in and discovering ancient cultures, starting to figure out those languages, reading those texts. It's ancient philology. Moving onwards to classical philology, which also starts to be more popular, classical in this case, Arabic philology, becoming more popular around that time, the early 19th century. You start having all these academies and Oriental societies, people trying to read in those languages, reading Arab poetry, reading Arab literature, reading learned discourse on Islam and all kinds of other things. People deciphering hieroglyphs, making discoveries, that kind of thing. It's where the discipline of Orientalism starts, according to Said. And we're getting into rougher waters relatively quickly. Now he looks at how that school is built up, and this is an important aspect, at the same time, how the enthusiasm for the Orient has always, at that time at least, also had a second side. That second side definitely being the literary side, with authors like Goethe and Flaubert and all kinds of other authors that either go there and travel. Richard Burton being Richard, Burton, being another person, like writers that travel the East. Mark Twain was there, for example. Herman Melville, like people traveling the so-called Orient, that mostly being the Levant and, well, obviously also India, which is sort of part of that whole complex because of English colonialism there. But we'll get to that in a moment. And writing fictional accounts about it. The travelogue is a huge thing in the 19th century. You can find a lot of them, of people traveling there. And how those two, the academic discipline of philology, of reading, categorizing and so forth, those languages, and on the other hand, writing enthusiastic, fantastic stories about the so-called Orient, how they interplay over a long time, and through all of that, in a way, build up an image of the Orient that is very much, and this is where we'll come to the big problem here, right? That is very much a construction and a look at the so-called Orient from the outside. What is Orient is defined by a bunch of mostly Westerners, who some of them have actually been there. Most of them have just like read other authors, other learned sources and so forth, and thus an image is constructed from the outside that defines what is the Orient. And there's an important aspect there, and that is that people living in these areas called the Orient, which, depending on where you look, is either just, the North African and Arabian Gulf and that area, but sometimes extends all the way to India, because, the colonialist part that we're going to get to. People that are from these areas are rarely heard. Their voices are not part of that discourse. That definition, that image is a construction from the outside, and I'll come back to that later on. Now, why is this a problem? Well, there's a bunch of problems there, and the big problem is that the 19th century, being largely about colonialism, both of the French and the English variety, has a need for people that know, so to speak, the Orient, because you need to administer your colonies and stuff. And this is where the academic discipline of the Orientalist becomes enmeshed with imperialism and has real-world political consequences. People that have read ancient texts and maybe never ever actually set foot outside of Western Europe are suddenly experts on an area that is governed with military force during imperialism. And that is where things become kind of tough, so to speak. And Said goes on to show how these images of the Orient and these so-called Oriental abide in like real world political situations. He quotes obviously people like T.A. Lawrence, who does very much use those stereotypes and so forth. And we all know sort of where the whole Oriental thing goes with Lawrence. He looks at Rudyard Kipling. He looks at like a lot of authors of the 19th century to make his point that the Orient is a place that is talked about, and the people living in the Orient are people talked about, defined as an abstract by a Western tradition, a Western construction of an image, and so forth. That's the large point that I want to focus on here. As I said, he looks at real-world consequences, both through the age of imperialism and the beginning, what he calls the American Empire after World War II, and how these images still have real-world consequences in a lot of ways. All right, so this is sort of the rough, very short summary of Orientalism, to look at how an academic discipline combined with a literary tradition form an image that seep into and define colonial and imperial activities, and thus have real-world consequences on a huge area of our planet, without ever talking, listening, and so forth to the people in those areas. And that's kind of bad, right? Now, what is the image of the Orient that Said presents? And I'll point out a few points out there, and then we'll go from there to the fantasy part. Now, Orientalism, possibly especially because of, historical aspects at the time, but also very much because of its start in more like ancient philology and rediscovery of Egypt, Sumer, Babylonia, those places, and its connection, which is also important, to biblical archaeology and the interest in, especially Palestine in that area, from biblical scholars who also look very much back, is, first of all, a story of loss. The idea is that the glory of the Orient was somewhere in the past, and it is now far diminished. So the historical dimension is important. What else are so-called characteristics of the Orient and the Oriental? And there's a very dangerous part there in like science, or the way science was handled in the 19th century, which combined with new disciplines of or huge steps forward in different disciplines like anthropology, biology, and so forth, combined different disciplines and tried to make points out of a, say, historical context or even a linguistic context, and try to transfer them into very racist stereotypes, like, we have basically proven that because of this and this aspect of the Arab language, we can prove that the brain, and say, it's horrific, it's fucked up, and unfortunately it is part of like how the West did science in the 19th century. So we'll just like leave this part here for a second as well, and come back to the ideas of like how the Orient or the Oriental person, I'll please imagine there's always air quotes around that when I say the Oriental. Point is, it is important that those cultures are seen as, as I said, constructions. And important aspects of those are they have somewhat fallen, they lack the capability of actually making it back to the heights of civilization from a Western standpoint, of course. They are prone to live under despotism, which they kind of need because they don't have enough personal agency to actually get stuff done, so forth. There is a level of decadence. There is a level of degeneracy. There's always a very strong, like, sensual, sexual undertone in a lot of the more fictional aspects or the literary aspects of that whole story, in a way. And well, as I said, there's more aspects to that, but that's like the large parts there. Like, live under despotism, are averse to logic and rationality, are superstitious, are prone to, fancy, are dishonest. It's a really toxic mix of stereotypes in a lot of ways. And well, we can find some of that are also like prone to religious fervor because of the interconnection with Islam, especially when we talk about the Orient more as the Palestine, Egypt, Arabic speaking parts of the world there. Now, obviously, there's a connection to the slow ending of the Ottoman Empire there on the more political end of things, but I can't get into that here as well, so we'll just once again, go read the book. There's interesting stuff in there. All right. So, now let's come to the point why I think this is important for fantasy, even for contemporary fantasy. Well, the argument is fairly simple, right? There is fantasy built in our world. Fantasy is a literary tradition that goes back to other traditions, and that's fine up to a point. We have obviously depictions of cultures that we might call Oriental in fantasy, and I think there's more to it in a moment. But I'll start out with images, more from the pulp adventure side of things. I'll go and talk about Robert E. Howard for a second here. So he writes a series of stories called El Borak, about a character, El Borak, which is an American fighting his way through mostly Afghanistan in the early 20th century. And those are obviously full of these kind of cliches and stereotypes. And why I'm choosing Robert E. Howard here for a second is not only because I generally enjoy reading a lot of his stories despite all the flaws, but he makes a wonderful example because he writes these so-called Oriental adventures in a way. And then he transfers to fantasy with his Hyborian Age, the Volusian Age of King Cole, and other aspects of his sword and sorcery fantasy stories. And I think they're a good point because what Robert E. Howard does at the time is he moves into a fictional age of this world because he doesn't want to contend with aspects of historical fiction where history nerds complain about him getting facts wrong. He's like, I want to tell a story, and I want it set in a fantastic area that looks cool, that reminds me of how I imagine a specific era of our time. That's what I want to do, and I don't want to deal with fact-checking all the time, which is fine. And we come to the Hyborian Age, which is obviously the Conan part. And because it has all these elements, it has very clear-cut examples of so-called cultures from our world. It has Stygia, which is very much ancient Egypt, but in evil. It has a lot of terrible racism when it comes to Kush and what he calls the Black Kingdoms. It has Shem, which is a more Arab-influenced kind of culture. It has a lot of these aspects. And Robert E. Howard, being, the kind of guy he is, obviously takes most of the stereotypes of Orientalism and transfers them into his world when he talks about these parts. And that's one of the ways how Orientalism makes its way into fantasy. Because despite people only talking about Tolkien, Robert E. Howard is hugely influential for fantasy in a lot of ways. We have similar aspects in some of the other authors of the time. Clark Ashton Smith sometimes moves into the idea of Eastern decadence in a lot of ways, but it's not as clear-cut as with Robert E. Howard. So let's just use him as an example here for now. In a similar way, we have obviously Mark Lawrence with his depiction of Afrique, which is Northern Africa, which is clearly part of the Orient, in the Broken Empire trilogy when King York, Prince York, King York, whatever, York Ancraft walks to Afrique and walks to basically what is basically Morocco. And we have the same kind of cliches of a long fallen civilization. Now, good, the entire world is kind of fallen, but we have the same idea of decadence, laziness, poverty, dissolution in Afrique with all those racist cliches that we find there, which is unfortunate because he could have gone a different direction with the whole thing, right? Now, let's move on to other authors and the second world fantasy. And this is, I think, where the danger lies, or where the issue lies. All right, second world fantasies, let's call them that, are worlds, are stories set in a fictional world that is not our world. The Broken Empire's take place on our planet in the far future, the Hyborian Age is technically our planet in the far past. So we'll go to different worlds. And here is another interesting aspect, and I think it's why Orientalism is so pervasive in fantasy. Remember when I said that Orientalism is a construct? Is a construct of Western origin about a world or a part of our world that has very little to do with the actual realities on the ground there. Well, I mean, constructing cultures or images of cultures is exactly what authors do when they do their world building. And obviously we don't do that in a vacuum. We also go back to other inspirations, traditions, and so forth. And having an already ready-made, basically world-building style constructed culture that we can just like take over, which we have with the Orientalist way of describing the Orient, right, is very tempting to do. Because it does already follow the same kind of requirements, broad strokes, easily recognizable signifiers and so forth that we usually use when we build a world, because we can't, build it in all the nuance and complexity that the real world has. So it's kind of tempting. And yes, we can, use some aspects, change some aspects, change skin colors, but we don't even necessarily do that as authors. Well, I'm not an author, but, world builder as a game, as a GM as well, and I was certainly guilty of that. So let's look at some of the examples there that do the same kind of thing. The Forgotten Realms, I think they have become better at it at this point, but when you go back and read old Salvatore novels or world box sets and stuff from the 80s, when you move to places like Kalimshan, those are absolutely stereotypical Orientalist places with all the racist undertones that has, with the poverty, the decadence. We don't even disguise as hard. It's also in the desert, and everyone's a bandit and can't be trusted, but uses very flowery language. And it takes a lot of these things and just puts them somewhere, and just uses them because they're already ready-made. You can just drop them in, and everyone knows that it's a construction, it's an image, right? We all know that the Orient described in novels, in 19th century novels, has nothing to do with reality. We sort of do know that in the back of our mind, ideally. So we could just take that and use it as a ready-made fantasy culture. And that's pretty ugly, because it obviously perpetuates those stereotypes, those ideas. And as I said before, and as Said tries to prove, those have real-world consequences, really hard, direct real-world consequences, because we connect those ideas with other ideas that we already have in our mind. I don't need to talk about the threat of Islam as it is perceived by some parts of the West, especially in the last couple of decades. Once again, I don't need to talk about that, but that's sort of the connection that we make subconsciously when we read those kind of things. Let's take another example: the First Law trilogy, the first one. As I said, I haven't read the new stuff, and I assume that it has gotten better, but we have the Gurkish there, who are very clearly a stereotypical Oriental culture. We have them, they usually show up in masses, which is another thing that Said points out about Orientalism, or the image of the Oriental in depiction, which is usually as a large mass of people, because they are dehumanized and just seen as a mass of people, which we have especially with the second one, Before They're Hanged, and the defense of Dagoska and stuff like that. We have those elements there. We have the tyranny, the religious tyranny through the prophet. We have them set in a a desert culture. And those are all those stereotypes. Now you can argue, and there's an argument here in sort of almost defense of Joe Abercrombie that I will not leave behind, and that is that all the other cultures of his world are also very stereotypical and critical. You look at Adjoa and the Union, and it is very much a depiction of colonialist England and the gentleman officer and how they're all like absolute arseholes, and I get that, and it's well done in that regard. We look at the Northman, we have like how he slowly subverts the trope of the northern barbarian, and I'm very happy with that as well. Unfortunately, it doesn't work for the Gurkish, because even if you argue that the prophet is obviously an external force with his belief and so forth, which you can argue because he's, just another one of those wizards, that does still fall into the despotism trope and the idea that you need to actually have a foreign ruler to actually keep those places working, which is part of the justification for imperialism and colonialism in the Orient, which is once again tied back to those tropes, to the image of the Orient in fiction and Orientalist studies in the 19th century. So while in other parts it works, it unfortunately does not work and fails brutally with the Gurkish in the First Law trilogy, which is a real shame. And finally, let's have a quick look at Wheel of Time for a second here, because this will sort of bring me to the final point here, because the Wheel of Time does have several cultures that have very specific Orientalist stereotypes. There's obviously the slave-holding Shan-Chan. And there's an important argument here that I want to make a point here before we stop this. And that is, when I was talking about my issues with it, someone says but it can't be Orientalist because they're not in the Orient. There is no Orient in Wheel of Time. And see, that's exactly the big point here. The big point is that because of the fictionality of the Orient in that Orientalist tradition, it doesn't really matter where you set that point. It just has to be the other from a higher cultural viewpoint, higher in their self-definition, because you have always that point that the West is looking at the Orient from a position of of cultural strength. There's no equality there. And that is very much what you see in The Wheel of Time and how the Shan-Chan are described. They live under despotism, the empire. They are connected to a former older glory. They speak the old tongue in some regards still. They are connected to Arthur Hawkwing and that glorious past. You have all of that connected there. They're highly superstitious. They are still into slavery. You have the element of sexuality and sensuality with the Duck of Ale wearing nothing, which is why do we need to know that? So we have all of these elements there. And though they come from the West, that doesn't really matter, because you could plant that fictional Orient wherever the fuck you want, as long as it is clear that it is written from a perspective of cultural strength or superiority, imagined obviously, and you look down on those people. And that's exactly what the Wheel of Time does, with Randland being all cultural superior and or having free people and a will to actually do stuff and not having to live under despotism and so forth. And that's my final point there, is we can take these images of Orientalism that we have found in that literary historical tradition. We can transplant them into a second world fantasy, although I know Wheel of Time is technically in our future. But, we can transport them into second worlds, into all kinds of fantasy worlds, and put them anywhere, but as long as we are basically looking down at that culture, and the author is looking down at that culture from a perspective of superiority. As long as those general tropes remain, the despotism, the sense of cultural loss, of inferiority, of desolation sometimes even, of the sexual undertones, the superstition, as long as all of these elements remain, these are still the same tropes. And once again, because we don't live in a vacuum, we will, as readers, connect them to all kinds of other things in our brains. subconsciously. They reinforce stereotypes, they reinforce ideas, and that is where the big problem with this whole thing lies. So, I've done most of the things I said I would. I've given a short summary. I've defined what I mean as like Orientalism in that construct. I think I've tried to make a point on like why it is so easy to transfer that into fantasy, why it is a huge problem in fantasy, and let's wrap it all up with that political dimension again. And that is, once again, that Orientalism starting out as that literary and scientific tradition was very much complicit in imperialism, in colonialism, and in making the world a harder place and a worse place for a lot of people. And it still does have that effect nowadays. So taking those constructs and without subverting them, without changing them up, without, breaking them down and just transporting them into our fantasy worlds, makes us complicit in that as readers and as writers and as GMs. It's like we're taking that and we're docking up, we're connecting to those images that are still in our brains, because we have, obviously, most of us in the West at least, have read, watched all kinds of places with these Orientalist stereotypes in fiction, news portrayals, history. It's hard to escape that shit. And having those things reinforced in fantasy books is, on the one hand, obviously very successful for an author, because it is easy for us to connect that. We just like have those images in our brain after the first one or two big stereotypes are hit. But it is pernicious and it's absolutely devious. And it really is a huge problem that we should be aware of, which is why I think reading something like Orientalism, thinking about it, looking at cultures presented to us in fantasy books, seeing all those problems, and then making our own judgments, being able to maybe filter out or at least dampen down the darker effects of that, is very helpful for us as readers. It's something that I think we should do. And yes, I haven't even spoken about Dune here, because Dune, it's very much its own animal. That might be a discussion for a different day. Anyway, I hope I've made my point on why Orientalism matters for fantasy, and not in a good way, and where we should go from here. I would very much like to hear your opinions on all of this. Tell me what you think. Tell me what I should think. Tell me all these wonderful things. Like, subscribe, do those wonderful things. If you really feel like making my life happy, go to the Patreon. I will knit you a hat or a scarf as one of the options. And winter will certainly come. And yeah, maybe as a bonus, if you know well done fantasy that does subvert Orientalist tropes, put them down in the comments so we can talk about the good stuff. Anyway, have a great day. Cheers.